We're now going to invite two people from the sector to give their responses to the research project. So I'm first going to hand over to Clare Mills, who's the Director of Policy and Communications at Charity Finance Group. Clare, over to you.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks for inviting me to take part in this session this afternoon. It has been so interesting. So if I've got my head down, it's because I'm reading all my scribbles as well as thinking about the things I'd already thought about saying. The first question, so we got given 4 questions as responders, and the first one was, what's the most interesting thing about this research in this period in time to you? I think looking at the sector, what struck me so much over the last couple of years has been the creativity and the innovation and the dedication and commitment that there's been across the sector in responding to COVID. In terms of this research, one of the really interesting pieces I found was about looking at reserves, because it's been it's the how long is a piece of string question for charities. How much to have, how much is too much, how much is not enough, when do we need to put money in reserves and when can we actually spend it? When do we need to put money in reserves to think about boring things like pensions? Does that, do donors really want to give us money? What will they say if they're giving us money to do good things and they see us going, well, we need to put this away for our forthcoming long-term pension fund liability? Are they going to be turned off by that? Are they going to be still willing to do that? So that's been interesting. And also the other thing about reserves is if you're putting money away for a rainy day and it starts to rain, when is it raining enough to start spending that money? So much around reserves that I just find really interesting. Other aspects of reserves, when is having decent reserves a barrier to either achieving grant income or to public donations or to all your other income streams? When do you reach the point of having a safe amount of reserves, but is it actually then having unintended consequences? You might feel more secure, but then it has an impact on your income generation. So I found that interesting. About the data, looking at the dissolutions in particular, I wanted to know, is it too soon to tell whether COVID had a real impact on that? My first job back in the day, first 2 jobs, was in insolvency, and we used to find that there was a real lag in when the recession hit or when a depression started, when things were tough for business and when the insolvency cases started to kick in, and it was typically 18 months to 2 years. So I think maybe it's perhaps a bit too soon to tell if COVID's going to have a big impact on the number of charities closing. And in relation to that as well, I also wondered if some of those dissolutions might not have taken place yet, simply because the people involved have had too much else to think about. Maybe if you're a charity trustee, you do have responsibilities, but perhaps you've had so much else going on in your life over the last couple of years that deciding to close the charity has been low down the list of priorities. Might just be thinking, we'll just keep it ticking over, we'll have to sort it out at some point. I'd be really interested to follow this data in the years ahead and just see what comes out of that. The other thing I think has been really interesting over the last 2 years is the move to digital, but I'm going to come back to that in a minute. The second question we got given was, how does this link to what we're doing and what we're seeing across the sector? I think for me, I find it particularly interesting in relation to the work around supporting small charities. So we're seeing coming up in the next couple of weeks, actually, the closure of the Small Charities Coalition. And I know that there's been a huge number of people working behind the scenes to try and make sure there's still ongoing provision for support for small charities, infrastructure support. It's been a big collaborative piece of work. And part of that, I think, has come from the collaborative environment that developed during the COVID pandemic. It felt almost as though that move to more collaboration across infrastructure was something that was really needed, and COVID actually acted as a catalyst to make that happen. And I'd be interested to know if that's been happening across groups of charities that aren't infrastructure bodies but who've got similar aims and objectives. Will we start to see more mergers and acquisitions? Is that going to become, if people have got shared purpose and they can see efficiencies of scale or more impact as a result of working together, are we going to start to see that? And so what's that impact going to be on the data that we've got? In relation to our own work, well, I work in policy and communications. Our policy work's looking at making sure that charities benefit or aren't adversely affected by government's policies. So we've got a lot going on around VAT, red tape, procurement, and all of those different aspects. And the stuff around local government spending, I think, is going to be really interesting to see how that pans out. We've reached a point where local government's budgets have been cut progressively over the years of austerity. They got some money back during COVID, but they'll say nowhere near enough, just as we across the sector would say that 750 million from the government was nowhere near enough. Never thought I'd say 750 million wasn't enough money, but would have been nice to have some more. But our role really is about inspiring financial leadership. You can see that behind me, and thinking about the practical and technical implications of a crisis. So what about these practical implications from this research? I think the first thing I'd like to think about is how we can share this more widely with the sector, but also making it relevant to individual charities in a way that's useful. Is there a way to solidify this research into a simple health check for charities? I don't know whether it's necessary. Do the trustees of charities know whether they are financially dependent on one income stream, whether they need to think about reserves? But maybe this would give them a way to put their own position into context and see how they compare to other people. What's the role for the regulators? You know, we fill in an annual return every year. Should it be more like an MOT? Should there be a response off the back of that if certain things are triggered, if you reach certain ratios or whatever? And the other problem with that, I suppose, is assessing your health as an organisation, just as when you're an individual. That's one part of the thing, but the next thing to do is see where you need some support, where there's things you can adapt to, where there's things you can change. And if there aren't any remedies out there, if we've not got a way of increasing the amount of unrestricted funding or other ways of helping charities in that way, is it all a bit pointless? Knowing that you're dependent on one income stream, but there's nothing you can do about it to find other sources of funding. So that I think is where the infrastructure bodies and the sector as a whole can start to work together. One of the things that I thought was really interesting, but I don't know if it's been mentioned as part of this, is the work Charities Aid Foundation have been doing on developing your ask for resilience funding as a charity, as well as developing an ask for your core costs. So whereas we see funders traditionally being asked to fund project costs, then maybe project costs with an element towards core, because that's what's needed to deliver the project as well as the project costs themselves. Now some ask for resilience funding. How can we build in, I think they recommend 15% to go towards having that time to spend on looking at your diversification, looking at your income streams, looking at how you can work more effectively. So I think that's really a good area to think about. And the other thing on that, perhaps a sadder thing to think about, well, it is a sadder thing to think about, is when we come to practical implications, what is the impact of a crisis on charities? So we're now, we've had, I guess this comes into the next thing of what the wider implications as well for policymakers and think tanks. We can't look back over the last 2 years necessarily and work out what's Brexit and what's COVID. So we might be seeing some crossover, some duplication, some things that we don't have a control group of charities that haven't been affected by Brexit or COVID, that haven't been affected by Brexit but not COVID, or COVID and not Brexit. And now we've got the situation in Ukraine, which I wrote a piece about last week. It's going to have an impact in practical charity work, in practical operations, and thinking about cybersecurity, energy costs increasing along your supply chain because those organisations will have increased costs, and the cost of living for your staff, and also the impact on investments if charities are relying on investments for income streams. So there's all those wider implications. Looking back, there were a lot of calls at the beginning about, the charity sector has never been more needed. I know I was saying all of that. I know Sarah was too, that we could be seeing charities collapsing when they're going to be needed to do various things. But the sector didn't collapse. So were the dire predictions inaccurate? Well, we just don't know, do we? We don't know what benefit we got from government support, what benefit we got from funders, what benefit we got from the public. Again, there's no control group. I think so. Looking at the longitudinal data, that's going to be really interesting. And finally, for policymakers, I think maybe just as we've got used to do nothing being something we look at in an options appraisal or a risk assessment, maybe we now need to have a what if there was no charity sector and we want to deliver this public policy? In the same way, perhaps, that we used to talk about rural proofing. I don't know if that's still a thing, but maybe we need to talk about VCS proofing. What would this policy look like if we didn't have the voluntary and community sector filling the gaps that the public sector isn't and the private sector won't fill? So that's my my takeaway from that. How can we do some VCS proofing?
Thank you so much.
Back to Sarah.
Thank you so much, Claire. That was fascinating to listen to. I'm going to now hand over to our second speaker, who's going to give his reflections on what we've heard, and that's Duncan Shrubsole. And Duncan's the Director of Policy and Partnerships and Communications at Lloyds Bank Foundation. Over to you, Duncan.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks to everybody involved in this research. So I'll do my best to keep to the 10 minutes, and I've structured it around three things. Pick up the questions you asked about what's this telling us, why does it matter, what should be done. So for those of you who don't know, Lloyds Bank Foundation is an independent charitable trust funded by the profits of Lloyds Banking Group, or one of 4 across the UK. The one I work for covers England and Wales. Our focus is smaller local charities tackling key complex social issues in communities right across England and Wales. We provide funding, we provide support to help charities develop their capacity, and we seek to influence on the issues facing them and those they serve. And research and evaluation is really important to us, and we're passionate about having a strong, healthy voluntary sector that doesn't just deliver services, that speaks up and it's truth to power and is informed by evidence. So think about this research. It's a really welcome contribution. What's it telling us? It's a really welcome contribution to our collective knowledge, bringing together other insights from surveys, the almanac, which always has a bit of a lag, so this helps be a bit more contemporary, and things that we've done ourselves and others have done in terms of analysing monitoring reports. Every monitoring report every charity sends us, we do read, and we learn and glean insight from it, and bits of research that we've commissioned. So clearly the headline findings from this research about the unprecedented challenges to income are really important and can't be overstated enough, that 2/5 of charities experiencing a reduction of over a quarter of their income is massive. The report talks about, we've talked a bit about this today, and we might reflect on it more, that despite fears, we haven't seen some of the predictions of charity closure that surveys picked up. I think it's really important to note that those surveys weren't wrong. When people are asked what they're predicting forward, that if things stay as they are, all things being equal, then the pressures that charities would be facing means that a proportion of them would have to close. The point is, all things aren't equal, because things don't stay the same. Charities change and adapt constantly. They don't wait till they run out of money. They foresee that and adapt and change. Indeed, it's trustees' duty to do so. So that means that they may take corrective action before they get to that kind of endpoint. The report talks about challenges around diversifying income. And this is a real particular issue because, like many, we've encouraged charities that we fund and support to diversify their income over recent years through trading, fundraising, social enterprise. And it has been tricky that those charities who have done the right thing, as it were, to grow their enterprise income and fundraising have suffered particular drop-offs over this last period. And those who had more stable income and singular income sources have have done a bit better. And that's something we really need to kind of look at and explore more going forward. Things the research says about reserves, and also the complications and complexity and diversity of charity funding models, even between charities that might look similar and be doing similar things, is something it's really important to note and reflect on and think more about. So why does this matter? Well, all of us involved in the charity sector have seen charities be more resilient and adaptable than sometimes they've been given credit for, particularly by government and others. They're used to endlessly cutting their cloth, adapting and evolving. Whilst the evidence has suggested a level of hibernation as amongst some charities, we know many charities went to extraordinary lengths to step up and show up for communities, often without the backing of some of the government funding schemes that went to the private sector. The parts of the voluntary sector that we are closest to at Lloyds Bank Foundation have generally been busier than ever, supporting more people, providing a wider range of support, showing fantastic resourcefulness and mobilising volunteers and resources, not all of which of course flows through charity accounts. So there's quite a lot of things that charities have made happen that haven't gone through the finance side of charity accounts. We captured in research last year, but the value of small in a big crisis, the tremendous energy, flexibility and professionalism charities had, particularly smaller charities, had done to show up, support communities, use their position of trust to keep particularly vulnerable people safe, informed, fed and supported when they needed it most. In contrast a bit to the public sector, which was slower to react, and sometimes mutual aid, which moved early but dissipated over time, whereas charities have stayed the course. And staying the course has had huge value, social and economic, for individuals, communities, the public sector and the wider economy, with charities showing real absorptive and adaptive capacity, soaking up the impact of COVID and the associated crisis on their work, and adapting often continuously as the COVID situation changed and other situations change too. But this has had a cost on workforce, on burnout, on exhaustion of staff and volunteers. And again, this may not appear in the financial accounts, but it's really important that we note that that's happened. I think it's also important that we talk about that actually there are quite a lot of the charities we support have actually grown their income during COVID because they were able to get emergency funding from grant makers like ourselves, but also from government sources. And this suggests the importance of really being really effective at talking about what charities do and who they serve, because this can leverage in money and support. So we know that despite immense efforts by NCVO, all the infrastructure community and including ourselves to talk to government about the 4 billion funding gap, actually that struggled to have traction with government. Whereas when we talked about what charities were doing, such as helping around domestic and sexual abuse or homelessness or supporting vulnerable people through COVID, that resonated. And government and others did find new and additional resources to support such charities. So I think it's really important that our story is always led by what charities do and who they serve. And so we don't sound like a producer interest that needs help just because we suffer losses. It's always got to be what is it we're doing and what will be the impact of any losses if we have them. We also do need to explain a bit more about how we don't shut up shop when we have reduced income. So the bits of the public sector can literally run out of money, as do private companies. But yet charities, as we've said, adapt and take corrective action before they get to that position. That does mean there is the potential that policymakers can suggest we're crying wolf and saying, look, you did get through and said you weren't going to. And we need to really explain that we aren't crying wolf. We have taken an action, but also reduced income does have impacts in terms of reduced services for the groups and communities who need them, and that financial shortfalls have been too often made up by the efforts of staff and volunteers, sometimes literally in blood, tears, toil and sweat, making up for the loss of hard cash. And that has huge implications for charities now and going forward. So my third point and final point would be, what should we do about this? How do we respond to this research? Now, all research always concludes by saying more research needed, but actually I think it is true here that we do need to do more to look below the headlines. As John and the team have set out, we do need to understand the particular impacts and longer term consequences of income reductions on certain geographical areas or fields of charity activity or types of organisations. Has it weakened the sector and services and voice it provides in those key areas? And we have to unpick headline financial patterns to look at particular income compositions or level of reserves. Does that have a decisive influence on the prospects of certain charities, their likelihood of closure, but also their resilience, independence and effectiveness and ability to recruit and retain staff? We've been doing some work at Lloyds Bank Foundation trying to look at organisational resilience to try and help charities think not just about absolute income levels, but the extent to which they feel they are in control of their financial position, even in difficult times, and how resilient they feel in response to anticipating shocks and the shocks that they do face. And we think there's more should be done looking at resilience. We also need to do better at trying to tell that story of the complexity of charity finances while also not making it too complex, which is obviously an oxymoron. We've got to simplify and amplify the story of how charities work whilst recognizing that it is a very complicated picture. I don't have any answer to that, but that's a particular challenge for how we talk to national and local government. As a funder, it would be important to note there are lessons for grant makers in this research. And as John and the team have highlighted, grant makers did help some parts of the sector that were emergency support was provided by funders. There are some questions as to the extent to which we provided that support to those charities we already knew. We could go out to them and say, hey, if we can help in any way, do come and talk to us. Obviously really helpful for those who were funded, but those who were not funded currently by Grantmakers, did that reduce the level of support that was available? At terms of Lloyds Bank Foundation specifically, we did provide some extra support, but we did take the conscious decision we wanted to keep open for new business. And actually we changed our model to now provide unrestricted multi-year funding to all new grantees. We've grown the kind of capacity building support we provide, and we also specifically set ourselves the target, and it's a minimum target, that 25% of those charities that we fund will be led by and for Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities. And we're currently at 30% of our funding, and that's really important to us. And it has meant we're funding also smaller charities and charities that we hadn't funded in the past, and that becomes a virtuous circle. You change your marketing, your application processes, your support packages, and in turn, charities that didn't apply to us in the past see that other charities are being funded and now they choose to apply, and that's kind of been a constant positive. But there's a lot of work gone around that. And we've also been part of initiatives led by IVAR and others to look at open and trusting grant making, also seeking to influence public sector funding and commissioning, and do more to think about funder collaboration, supporting ACF's efforts around that. But Grantmakers are only ever a small part of the system, and public sector and fundraising will always be key. And so we do, like others, remain very worried that actually the financial position is going to remain very challenging and may even get worse over the months and years to come. As emergency cash comes to an end, central and local government tighten their belts, all the things that Claire's just talked about rising costs and demands facing charities kind of continues to play out. So we certainly, although this research program is ending, we certainly need to be looking really closely at the financial picture of charities going forward. And to conclude, it's really important that we always think about that external context in which charities sit and their financial positions are within, because COVID hasn't been binary, although we liked to talk about there was the COVID period, and we're now in the post-COVID period, and now generally in life we're all looking forward to doing things that we maybe didn't do during COVID. It's really important to realise that many people in communities are still dealing with the direct consequences of COVID in terms of domestic and sexual abuse, mental health, loneliness and isolation, poorer physical health and delayed treatment, prisoners still locked up 23 hours a day, lost schooling and vulnerable children and young people without help. And the charities are right on the front line of dealing with all those issues. And whilst the medical side of the pandemic may be becoming less severe, as a society, and particularly as charities whose purpose of existence is to make a better world, there's still a pandemic of poverty, a pandemic of structural inequality and racism, and a climate crisis and global conflict. So charities are always more than money, and amazing things can be done on very little when people of goodwill come together, but money does help things happen. And certainly more things can happen when there's more money. So it's vital that individually and collectively we do our bit to seek to grow the cake of funding for charities and to make sure that whatever cake exists is distributed fairly, efficiently and effectively. And at Lloyds Bank Foundation, we're committed to doing our part to try and help make that happen. Thank you. Back to Sarah.
Thank you so much, Duncan. That was fantastic. We've had quite a lot of questions in the chat, so I think we'll move to Q&A now. My colleague Alex is going to field those questions, so I'll hand over to him to either ask the questions or invite people to ask their own questions, whichever way you want to do it, Alex.
Maybe I ask the questions.
Cool, sounds good.
Thanks, Sarah. Sarah and I were in the same room and can't have both of our mics open at the same time, so needed to coordinate there. So we've had a few questions that were posted in the chat boxes earlier. And John, I know you've put some of these answers in the chat, but I think it's always useful just to hear some of the responses. So we had a question from Carl Wilding, asking, John, can we split the analysis into grant makers and operating charities? Again, you've given some indication in the chat box, but maybe just tell us about what is possible for us to do and what's not. And John, you're on mute, I think.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so we didn't, that's one we haven't picked up on yet. The Grantmakers, is certainly the kind of group one would expect are on, as opposed to more operational organisations, aren't spending every last penny that they earn, and will have patterns of bringing income in that aren't totally reliant on people coming through the door. So there will be potentially, with organisations like that, a different kind of relationship between income and expenditure. And yeah, we do need to look at them. I think the point I was trying to make there was that there's what is it that's different about the mix of organisations? We've got this 10% who in this most recent period are only spending 35% of what they've got coming in, as opposed to in previous years it's been around 50%. So what's the change in the composition of those organisations? Yeah, it's something we need to look at. It's quite a stark finding in the graphs that we put together. So it's definitely something we want to pursue. I don't have an answer at the moment. But we can do it. I mean, there's pretty refined classifications of organisations now. I'd give a shout out to the work David Kane and Chris Dam have been doing more recently to try and enable us to get to more granular levels of detail in the work we can do on fields that organisations operate in. So we may be able to pursue it.
Thanks, John. Just picking up on another question, but links. You mentioned there the 10% of charities who are only spending kind of 35% of the income they've got coming in. Also on that graph, there was at the top 10% of charities who are spending kind of 60% more than they've got coming in. What do we know about who those kind of 10% are? Do we know anything about kind of type, size, what they might be doing? Do we know anything about them?
No, I mean, in any given year, you've always got, there's lots of tricky measurement problems in this field, and in the time we've got left, it's probably not to go into too much detail about individual elements of that. But as I'm sure will be familiar to many people, simply saying the ratio between income and expenditure has changed is like lots of these measures, a fairly one-dimensional way of looking at it. There will be perfectly good reasons why organisations spend more than they have coming in any given year. It might be because there's expansion of some kind going on that's going to be balanced by expectations of income coming in further down the road. But what's interesting with a data set of this size, and where I think I'd emphasise again the importance of the large-scale data, is that to some extent there'll be a fair amount of random variation at the level of individual organisations there. But with a data set of this size, you see something quite large scale and systematic. So you can be fairly confident that something different is happening now. And I guess our initial supposition in that case was it's organisations that have been able to carry on spending for some reason, but income is perhaps also constrained. There's this change in the balance between the two, but the same answer to both questions really. We don't yet know the mix of the organisations concerned.
So more research to be done. The next couple of questions I'll probably just link together if that's okay. So these are from Leslie and from Sean. So Leslie asks, kind of, to what extent was analysis on type of voluntary income able to be conducted using annual account data? We obviously at NCVO do some of that research as well on almanac and voluntary sector income. And Sean's question was around, can you confirm what organisations you looked at to analyse income diversification? Was it limited to organisations with an income smaller than 500,000? That was to Alistair during Alistair's presentation, I think.
It would be above rather than below it, actually.
Oh, sorry, yes.
On that last point, because it's the part. It's either the Part B returns in England and Wales, or whatever their Scottish equivalent is at 250,000 and more, or it would be the almanac data, where I think we've tended to stick with analysing the larger scale organisations because they're more heavily sampled, and so the data is more comprehensive and robust. And the income mix, again, depends on the data set we're using. There's some limitations with the stuff you get from the regulators about how you can break down, for example, in income from charitable activities, is that the form of fees from individuals, or is it contracts from government? It's that kind of conundrum, which you can get beyond to some degree with the data from the almanac sample of organisations.
Thanks, John. And just to add, yep, we, of course, on the almanac, data.ncvo.org.uk, we do break down looking at kind of annual returns of financial data around kind of the types of voluntary income and how that's changed over time. A question from Chris, which was from the group that I was in with Chris. Have you looked at the relationship between charity reserve levels and whether charities then cut their expenditure during kind of pandemic time? One might hypothesize that those with higher reserves would be less likely to cut expenditure, so reserves kind of sustaining activity during a temporary shortfall.
Okay, so we would be constrained to, in England and Wales, to the Part B data, which is 12,500 organisations. And then the challenge that would arise with, so we didn't do it. And one of the reasons, one of the challenges with that is there is, as you all know, quite a time lag in getting some of the data in. If you're only starting off with around 12,500 organisations to begin with, then if there's delays in some of them filing, we won't really be in a position to say with the sort of confidence we can with the large scale headline figures on income and expenditure, whether there are real differences taking place in both the levels of reserves and what's happened to expenditure. So I think it's the too early to tell kind of answer there, I'm afraid. But I mean, to kind of build on that, I think there's a question which is implicit in a lot of the very helpful comments we've had from Clare and Duncan here about, you know, how do we know, for example, what's the effect of things like interventions of various kinds, whether that's furloughs or grant schemes, because we don't have a, and also the more general question around COVID is and in things like Brexit is we don't have a control group. There are more sophisticated economists on the team here, Alistair, and I'm just wondering if there's something you might want to come in on about the challenges that we might face in going forward now. Just so I'm sure everyone's going to be tremendously interested, for example, in questions like, well, were the emergency grants that were made available the things that made the difference to organisational survival? But I just wonder, Alistair, if you'd like to comment on some of the challenges associated with that kind of work and how we might address them.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's not a straightforward issue. We're not going to be able to accurately decompose effects and attribute them to big events that are happening at the same time and overlap. I mean, I guess to some extent that's one of the reasons we want to bring in international comparisons, and we showed a little bit of that in connection with the dissolutions and formations, but we do also look at data available in other countries where they're going to have had a pandemic effect, but not necessarily not a Brexit effect. So I guess we can get at some of that with those sorts of comparisons, although obviously there are different institutional and cultural regulatory contexts for those patterns. I guess we can zoom in a bit with some of the more detailed data. If we look at some of the support schemes, some of the grant making data, that sort of thing, it might be possible to target into more specific sort of evaluations of some aspects there. But we're just going to be taking lots of snapshots from different perspectives and then trying to put it together to answer those sorts of questions as best we can.
Thanks, Alistair. Duncan, you've got a hand up.
Yeah, so just a reflection on this question about emergency grants and what it kind of might have helped do. So I think, and obviously this is a partial view from what we did as a grant maker and also knowing what charities told us, but they helped in three ways. Sometimes it was they helped cover shortfalls in income and costs that people were facing then. So money in, money out. So additional costs of whether it's IT equipment, PPE, hiring some more people or making up for an income losses. The second thing that it did was actually helped people do more services. So actually we've got grantees who developed more expansive services. They were able to kind of reach more people than they had done before. But the third thing it did is it helped people push other money to the right. And so that meant that they had, you give a very good specific example of that is we were part of the 750 million, a bit of it went to match funding, and we applied for some of that. We got 5 million out of DCMS, which we distributed. It had to be match funding, so we distributed it to people we were going to fund, but the DCMS money had conditions, it had to be spent. So charities spent that bit first and then our money after that. So it meant they could, the money that they had, they could push longer. We actually had it earlier this year, we were having fewer applications than we expected because people had money that they got from emergency pots, which meant that they were delaying applying to some of the funders that they would normally until that money had run out. So it did push. We kept thinking there was going to be a sort of cliff edge, and the cliff edges kept being pushed to the right in terms of funding because of the availability of emergency funding. Admittedly, as your report says, that won't be the case for everybody, but it will be the case for some. And so it's how does that unpick? And the bit that's really unclear is what's going on at local government level, because local government is doing lots of different things. Sometimes it provided emergency cash. Sometimes that more responsive grant making relationship is carrying on. Sometimes it's now reverting to saying, well, it's all over. Now we're going to go back to big scale commissioning, and it's likely that the money's going to go into in rigid contracts. And local government's own financial position is in itself a lot of flux. But I think what happens at local government level is going to be really, Claire said this as well, really key to what happens going forward. And obviously, you've got 350 odd local authorities who are going to do different things. So that will mean the picture is really quite varied. Thanks.
Thanks, Duncan. Claire.
Yeah, thanks. I put my hand up just as I got your message, Alex. I think that's a really interesting point about the local authorities that Duncan's just made. And I think the future in relation to local government finance, and we've got the procurement green paper being published and the government's response to it, the way that services are commissioned from charities, are they going to be commissioned in exactly the same way as from public and private sector? What's that going to do to income streams? What's it going to do if everything has to be commissioned as a service rather than there being maybe as many direct grants? Is going to be really, really interesting to see in the years ahead. One of the other things I wanted to pick up on there was something Duncan said about organisations, using funding to move to digital. How are we going to see the impact of that pan out? And that's something that came up in our breakout session, was where particularly government or public services are saying, oh, well, you switched to delivering that service digitally and it was cheaper. How's that going to, so we'll just fund it for digital in future. Maybe that's so, maybe it will have a lower cost, but maybe it's got a difference in impact. Perhaps you're reaching different groups, perhaps you're being able to support different sectors of the community to deliver things differently. But at the same time, we've now got a situation where the cybersecurity threat level has increased because of what's going on in Ukraine. So are we going to see a situation where it might be more costly to go back to delivering things face-to-face in the short term, particularly if you're trying to work with particular sectors of the community, but actually in the longer term, it's perhaps a way of delivering more stable services? So this whole issue around digital first, switching to digital against the context of increased cyber threat is going to be an interesting one.
Thanks, Claire. I think, John, you wanted to come in on a few of these points, and then we'll go to another question. John.
You've got another question waiting, Alex. Don't prioritise me above.
It's okay. We've got one more question waiting, so I think we've got time. So
okay, thanks.
Come in, John.
It was just to expand a little bit. Claire, I think, initially raised it about some of the practical use of this large-scale analysis and things like financial health checks for organisations and how useful they are. And I can totally see the challenge there. That you mentioned, Claire, which is around, well, what can organisations actually change if they get these kind of indicators? I think what I'd probably say there is that it may be useful to have the sort of data we've got available to grantmakers, which can enable them. And I'm prompted to say that partly by cross-referencing some of the indicators we constructed about what was happening in the finances of organisations over time. So it's like things like organisations experiencing, say, a 25% drop in their income over a 3-year period, or regularly experiencing a 25% of excessive expenditure over income. So there wasn't much relationship between the organisations that appeared to be, if you like, more financially distressed and the receipt of grants. Now, that could be for very understandable reasons to do with the particular purposes of individual grant schemes, but it prompts the reflection that this is the kind of contextual information armed with that might help back up grant makers looking at applications of organisations where you've got very tight decisions to make about prioritisation. Something about the prior financial history of an organisation might be useful in that kind of context. How far is it useful for the regulators? I think it depends on the extent to which regulators have got the capacity to monitor that on a large scale and what they themselves can do about it. There's a new chair of the Charity Commission. Is that someone who's going to be implying a more hands-off approach to regulating charities, in which case this large-scale database approach might be less of a priority? On the other hand, as people in the room will know, they are being much more open about the kind of data they've got and the use that might be made of some of it right now. So it may be useful. So I suppose what I'm saying is less useful to the individual organisation perhaps, but we can put this kind of information out there, and more for organisations trying to get a picture of a range of charities in particular contexts, perhaps around grant making.
Thanks very much, John. And certainly we know from, obviously you mentioned the Charity Commission there, but kind of a big focus of their work will be around kind of data, which is really welcome to see. And I hope that nothing will change in that respect with the new permanent chair announced. One more question from James, and I worry there might be a fairly blunt answer to this from you, John, but they discussed in their group, we discussed an observed rise in greater partnership working as a way of diversifying income streams over the past few years. Is there any way of picking this up in accounts data?
Well, no, but I mean, that's the point we've made generally, that there's what comes together in an analysis like this is a very diverse range of experience. And what we can produce from that is to say, well, here are organisations that look particularly different from the wider population of charities. So that might be a way of following that up with some sort of case studies, organisations that compared to others look as if their financial trajectory is more stable than others, or look to have weathered the storm a little bit better. So what's actually gone on there? But the short answer is, yeah, 2 letters, no.
Pretty much as I feared. I'm going to bring in Clare on this partnership point, but I think it is just worth making one small point. Like, I know it can be quite frustrating for us, but also for people listening in, when actually there's there's quite a big limit to what we can do with the data that we have available. And I always go back, and I never tire of telling this story, but to produce 2 years kind of later data on the almanac on charity finances, we have to manually input data from 10,000 PDFs from the Charity Commission. Like, that's the level of data that we are still kind of grappling with, and it's easy to think that our data should be so much better, and it should be, but it's because we're so limited. Even to get the level of data that we've got at the moment takes such significant work and investment, and it's frustrating to us all about kind of what we can then do with that. Clare, and then I think we're out of questions, and in which case I'm going to pass back to Sarah afterwards. Well, okay, Duncan, fine. One more from Clare, one more from Duncan, and then back to Sarah. Clare.
So the thought of inputting data from 10,000 PDFs has made me feel really, really queasy. Perhaps we need some partnership working on that. Partnership working is often put forward as like the great solution to so many things. Or, well, if we just work together, we can make it happen. But it doesn't come without a cost, does it? We know that you need to set time aside from other things you'd be doing to go and build those relationships. And it makes me particularly cross when I hear it coming from the public sector. Oh, well, we'll do some partnership working with charities. You hear it a lot, particularly around social prescribing. Well, we can just prescribe something, we can just send people along to this community group or that community group or the other, and it doesn't necessarily have any funding associated with it. So we're seeing the public sector expecting and having expectations of the voluntary and community sector that aren't resourced in any way, shape or form. And that is particularly irritating to those of us who know how much effort goes into that partnership working. Off the back of that, I think so. One of the things we need to recognise is a lot of the data we've been asked for by government over the last 2 years has been very much transactional data. How many volunteers did how many tasks for how many hours for how many people to what end? What we know is really significant is actually the amount of stuff that goes on that's relational. It's relationship building, whether that's mutual aid groups building up relationships in communities, breaking down barriers. Most of the aims that the government has set out in the Levelling Up white paper depend on better relationships. If we're going to see communities having more pride in themselves, in working together and all those things, that stuff doesn't come from just being given a shiny new bus station. It comes from having time for the voluntary and community sector to go out and engage with communities, for communities to take ownership of their own aspirations. Linking this back to the research, I'd be really interested to see how resilient the charities were that were in the areas in more need in the levelling up areas or the left behind areas, because we already know that those areas tend to have fewer registered charities. Are they also the areas with perhaps the most vulnerable charities? And so how can we use that to influence government to then put its money where its mouth is and help those areas that need it the most to turn into places where everybody would want to live or work or visit, and where those areas aren't just surviving but they're actually thriving, they're healthy communities with something really positive to look forward to.
Thanks, Claire, and particularly pertinent for kind of both our influencing around levelling up, but also as the government and the sector kind of co-produce the kind of community relationships and community spaces and relationship strategy as part of the Levelling Up white paper, in terms of that data and really understanding what is going on at a more granular detail. Also, what I heard you say there, Claire, was a very generous offer from CFG to take 5,000 of the accounts from the Almanac, which is a hugely generous public offer. So thank you for that. Duncan, over to you.
Sorry, cheekily sneaking in. I completely agree with everything Claire said about partnership and thinking about outcomes. But three quick things I think which is really worth us logging. One is absolute reductions in income have had absolute impacts. And it's not a sector we're close to, but you take medical research, where much less money raised is directly reduced the level of medical research that's happened over the last period and for some time to come. International development similarly, and they will have real impacts. Secondly, on income diversity and volatility, we're seeing charities that, as said previously, who had diversified their income, actually not struggling to go back to social enterprises and whatever, and others who are now wanting to go into it, but there's a danger that people slightly reinvent the wheel or past mistakes, and we need to kind of learn from that. But volatility actually is really key. You can, if you have a common level of income that's not as much as you want, but you know what it is, you can manage around that. Big peaks and troughs is a real challenge. And I think looking at volatility is really important. And lastly, I said it, but it's really important to go back to all the charities we fund, real challenges over staffing. And we've seen that in previously what happened in social care when, low contract values have really driven out quality of staff and professionals. But we're seeing charities losing support workers to Amazon warehousing, logistics, HGV driving, all other things. And if charities don't have enough money to pay good wages, then the outcomes that they can deliver will be massively hit. And so that's something we really need to focus on. And they cannot keep conjuring up amazing results from limited resources. So that's something that we're thinking about, and we would encourage everybody to think about. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you, Duncan. And really interesting final reflection there. Alex and I have literally just come from a meeting with local infrastructure bodies in Manchester, and they raised that as one of the top pressing issues at the moment in terms of the voluntary sector workforce. So I think we've reached the end. So I was just going to end with a few thank yous, starting with thanking Duncan and Claire for coming and sharing your reflections with us today. And as it's the end of this research series, I want to say a huge thank you again to our project funders, the Economic and Social Research Council, and UKRI. I'd also like to thank my colleague Alex for all his work that he's done to support this project. But the biggest thank you goes to our academic partners, the Third Sector Research Centre at the University of Birmingham with the University of Southampton and the University of Stirling, who've led the project. It's been a real pleasure to work with you all over this last year, building on a long-standing partnership with NCVO. So John, Alistair, Dermot, Michelle, Alan, David, thank you so much. And thank you to all of our participants for joining us today. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.